a century or two. And this historical reading of the Quran can actually help us as historians get a picture, a reconstruction of Muhammad as a historical figure. I personally believe in this approach as well. I've done some of my own research using this same method. I don't research the historical Muhammad per se, but I research Muslim concepts of revelation, and therefore I've analyzed the Quran in the same way. So what are the results of this analysis of the Quran from a historical viewpoint to get a picture of the historical Muhammad? Well, we can sort of divide the Quran into the Meccan Quran and the Medinan Quran. So what that means is that there are parts of the Quran, there are chapters of the Quran that were first recited by Muhammad when he was in Mecca. Then there's other surahs, chapters of the Quran that were first recited when Muhammad was in Medina. And there's a great difference in the political situation and context between the first 10 years of Muhammad's preaching in Mecca and the last 10 years in Medina. So Walid Saleh has a whole article on the Meccan Quran, which I'm sort of summarizing here. So in the Meccan parts of the Quran, it presents Muhammad as a mortal human, a messenger of God whose only responsibility is to recite God's message to an audience who for the most part, doesn't believe in him. Many Meccan surahs seem to indicate that the end of the world, the day of judgment, is near. This is somewhat similar to what we find in the Gospels. And the Meccan surahs, the Meccan chapters of the Quran, they warn Muhammad's skeptical audience with divine punishment, that if they do not heed and they don't obey Muhammad's guidance and preaching, there will be a divine punishment. Many Meccan parts of the Quran are defensive. They are quoting and refuting objections from Muhammad's audience in Mecca. And we know from the Quran and from outside the Quran that Muhammad and his followers were persecuted in Mecca, right? If you remember the reading from other readings, they were persecuted, they were rejected, people were being tortured, sometimes people were being killed. Muhammad's followers, some of them had to leave Mecca for Abyssinia. This is what the biographical tradition tells us, but the Quran indicates this as well. The Quran refers to this persecution of Muhammad and his followers as a fitna, this idea that they are being forced out of their religious beliefs. They are being forced to be pagans and give up their monotheistic beliefs and practices. So that's reflected in the Quran, that they are being persecuted. These are some verses from the Quran, the Meccan part of the Quran, that give you a sense of what is being said. And in these verses, you see very clearly that there's an emphasis that Muhammad's Meccan audience is perplexed and skeptical because Muhammad is a human being. That they expect, it seems, that God will send an angel to be God's messenger, or that God will send angels with Muhammad, or that God will perform miracles, for Muhammad, or Muhammad will perform miracles. And this is what the Meccan audience of the Quran wanted, and the answer to that in the Quran is that, look, Muhammad is just a human being. He's nothing more than a human being. So it's almost as if the Quran downplays the spiritual and theological status of Muhammad in the face of these objections. And of course, there's many different examples of this. Muhammad is told in the Meccan parts of the Quran that his only duty is to proclaim the message, and that's it. That Muhammad is not responsible for guiding any of these people who are rejecting him. He can't control whether his message is accepted or not. He's just to recite the Quran, deliver that message, and that's it. That he has no other mandate. This is what you find in the Meccan part of the Quran. So Muhammad's role in the Meccan part of the Quran is minimal, you could say. At least his personal role is minimal. Walid Saleh, in that same article that I've quoted, he puts it as such. The preacher of the Meccan Quran is radical in one way. He is almost powerless. This powerlessness was, moreover, a unique characteristic of Muhammad, distinct even from other messengers as presented in the Quran. For they, these past prophets, healed the sick, resurrected the dead, split the sea, controlled the jinn, were not burned by fire, and ultimately could make their God answer their prayers. The insistence on the humanity of the messenger was the basis of the Quran's response to pagan demands to perform miracles. The preacher of the Quran was a mere messenger with a limited mandate. The Quran might present the Hebrew prophets as a model, but Muhammad could not yet be one of them. So I'll just pause here. What's interesting about the Meccan part of the Quran is in the Meccan surahs, Muhammad is not called a prophet. He's called a messenger, but he's not called a prophet or a nabi. And that's an important point to note. So that is the image of Muhammad that you get in the Meccan Quran. The idea of Muhammad as merely a messenger, he's merely delivering something from God, and he's not really responsible. And in a sense, as Dr. Saleh relates in this quotation here, this seems to be a strategy. It's this by minimizing the role of Muhammad, Muhammad is not to blame for his people's rejection of the message. That Muhammad is sort of not implicated. The blame is sort of put on the disbelieving audience, and their basically their incorrect expectations of what a genuine revelation should look like. So that is how Muhammad appears in the Meccan parts of the Quran. Now, if we look at the Quran as a whole, we include the Medinan parts of the Quran, we get a different image. We get a vastly different image. And this here is a summary of the various descriptions, roles, and labels of Prophet Muhammad in the Quran as a whole. So now we're not just looking at the Meccan part, but we're looking at the whole thing. So the Meccan and the Medinan. And we see a change when we go to the last 10 years of Muhammad's life, where he is in Medina, where he's now, by most accounts, Muhammad is the political leader and the spiritual leader of Medina. And here he has an alliance, he has like an alliance of many, many different tribes, including Jewish tribes, and they've sort of all come together in a sort of confederacy. There's a constitution that they've all signed called the Constitution of Medina, and Muhammad is the leader of this polity. And that change of circumstances is reflected in the Quranic presentation of Muhammad in the Medinan verses. So you have a reading this week by Nikolai Sinai about Muhammad in the Medinan Quran. And he looks at many, many different verses, and I've just put some on the slide for you. So the first idea we find of Muhammad in the Medinan Quran is this notion that the Prophet Muhammad carries the very authority of God. He who obeys the messenger obeys God. Prophet Muhammad is told to judge people, right? Judge disputes on behalf of God, and the people are told that they have to obey the judgment of Muhammad. Those who give their allegiance to Muhammad, it is said that by doing so, they are giving their allegiance to God himself. In fact, the Medinan verses of the Quran say that somebody cannot be a believer or a person of faith until they make Muhammad the judge in all the disputes among them. So a condition to be a faithful believer is to submit oneself to the very authority of Prophet Muhammad. This last set of verses here is quite interesting, where the believers are told, do not be forward in the presence of God and his messenger, and raise not your voices above the voice of the prophet, and don't speak to him the same way you speak to one another. So there's almost a courtly etiquette that a believer or member of the community had to observe when they were in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad. Interesting, it says in the presence of God and his messenger. So in many phrases in the Medinan Quran, these terms appear together, God and his messenger or God and the messenger. And what that does is it fuses together the authority and the presence of God and Muhammad. They're referred to, God and his messenger, as one party or one unit. So people are told, if you have any disputes, refer it to God and his messenger, right? God and his messenger are the ones who are judging you, and so on. So that's this notion of authority. In the Medinan Quran, Muhammad is the bearer of divine authority, which is very, very important. He's basically the deputy of God on earth, and to the point and to the extent that people have to exercise a sort of courtly etiquette when they are engaging with Muhammad at a personal level. You also have a series of verses in the Medinan Quran where Muhammad is presented as the guide and the teacher of his community. This is important because now in the Medinan period, Muhammad's role is not to simply deliver a message and then go home. So he's not a fax machine for the Quran. He now has the duty of guiding and teaching his community on many, many different matters. So now his guiding role goes far beyond reciting the Quran, right? Rather, Muhammad has to also explain what the Quran means, and he has to deliver or convey a whole set of divine guidance that is now complementary to the Quran. So this is quite important as well. Now you have other verses in the Medinan part of the Quran where Muhammad plays the role of an intercessor. So an intercessor is a mediator, a middleman, if you will, between the believers and God. On this slide, you have two examples of this. The first Quranic quotation in blue, it basically says that those who commit sins, if they want to get God's forgiveness, they must go to Muhammad. They have to ask God to forgive them in the presence of Muhammad, and then Muhammad has to also pray to God to forgive them. And only if that happens, these sinners will be forgiven by God. So Muhammad is an intermediary or an intercessor between God and his community. And this same idea appears in another surah of the Quran, Surah 9, which is at the bottom here, where again, people are trying to the people have committed sins. They're trying to atone for these sins. So Muhammad is told to accept an offering from their wealth. So they actually have to give a portion of their wealth to Muhammad. Muhammad is to accept that. And then it says to Muhammad, purify and sanctify them. So Muhammad has to cleanse the sinners. He has to cleanse their souls. And he is told to pray for them, that praying for them will bring them peace. So Muhammad, through his prayer, brings peace to the souls of these sinners. And then it says at the end, after all this has happened, that it is actually God who took their offerings and God who accepted their repentance, although physically it's Muhammad doing it. So again here, Muhammad is presented as God's representative and God's intermediary for forgiving the sins and purifying the souls of certain members of the community who want forgiveness. So overall then, in the Medinan part of the Quran, right, this is during the last 10 years of Muhammad's mission, Muhammad is presented with a much higher status, a much more elevated status than he is in the Meccan Quran. And interestingly, if you look very closely, in many cases, throughout the Quran, there are certain names of God that are also used to name Muhammad or describe Muhammad. So one of God's names in the Quran is the merciful, Rahim, and one of Muhammad's names is also merciful, Rahim. Another name of God in the Quran is Azim, the great or the sublime, but Muhammad is also described in the Quran as Azim. His character is called Azim, or great character. God is called the guide. Muhammad is called the guide, the Hadi. God is called the guardian or the master, which is the word wali. Muhammad is also called the guardian or master, wali. God is called light, An-Nur. Muhammad is also called light. There are so many parallels. God is called a witness or an overseer. Muhammad is also called a witness or overseer. So in this real way, Muhammad in the Quran as a whole appears to be both God's representative in terms of carrying God's authority, but also at a human level, God's representation, in the sense that Muhammad seems to be a reflection of certain divine names and attributes insofar as they could be reflected at a human level. So this is actually quite important, right, for the status of Muhammad. Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran overall is God's deputy, God's representative, and God's agent, an intermediary for his dealings with humans.